It was 2005, the year MySpace was king. Paris Hilton reigned supreme, and Diddy, then still known as P. Diddy, hosted parties that redefined the meaning of excess. The stories about these events were the stuff of urban legend. Parties with diamond-encrusted bottles of champagne, walls that seemed to sweat luxury, and a guest list that could rival an awards show. But not every story that emerged from those gatherings made the headlines. Some were darker, grittier, surreal tales whispered in hushed tones by those who stumbled upon them. This is one of those tales, recounted by a pizza delivery guy who found himself on the periphery of Diddy's dazzling hedonistic universe. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Trevor Johnson, 22 years old and working as a delivery driver for Tony's Slice Heaven in Manhattan, had no idea his life was about to collide with the elite celebrity circuit. He was just another young guy trying to scrape by in a city that demanded everything from you. Trevor's world was small, contained within the radius of the pizzeria's delivery zone, but his nights often brought him glimpses of lives wildly different from his own. He delivered to Wall Street tycoons still hunched over their desks, to broke artists surviving off pepperoni slices, and occasionally to penthouse apartments where the extravagance made him wonder if he'd stepped onto a movie set. One night, the call came in just before closing. The order was massive, 10 large pizzas with every topping imaginable, plus an array of sides that screamed of a party in full swing. The address was uptown, a swanky townhouse with a reputation for hosting wild events. Trevor didn't think much of it. Celebrities ordered pizza too, after all. He loaded the pies into the car, punched the address into his clunky GPS, and set off, unaware that he was driving into a night he would never forget. The townhouse loomed like a temple of decadence. Even from the street, Trevor could hear the deep bass of music pounding through the walls, accompanied by the occasional roar of laughter or breaking glass. He rang the doorbell, half hoping someone would just sign the receipt and let him leave. But the door swung open, and he was greeted by a towering bodyguard dressed in all black, earpiece glinting under the dim porch light. "You're late," the bodyguard grunted, stepping aside to let him in. Trevor's protests about Manhattan traffic died in his throat as he stepped into the foyer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and marijuana, mingling in a way that made his head swim. Everywhere he looked, there were beautiful people. Models, actors, musicians, all draped in designer clothes, sipping from crystal flutes. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister glittering with what Trevor could only assume were real diamonds. "Pizza guy!" someone shouted, drawing cheers from a group lounging near the bar. Before Trevor could process what was happening, several guests swarmed him, snatching boxes from his hands and tearing into them like they hadn't eaten in days. "Diddy loves Tony's!" a woman with impossibly high cheekbones purred, her lips curving into a smile as she bit into a slice of pepperoni. "He says it's the only pizza worth eating in this city." Trevor nodded dumbly, clutching the receipt and pen he'd brought for a signature. His eyes scanned the room, catching snippets of the madness unfolding around him. A man in a white fur coat was doing lines of coke off a silver platter. Two women in sequined gowns were throwing handfuls of glitter into the air, laughing as it rained down on them. And in the corner, illuminated by the glow of a massive aquarium filled with exotic fish, stood the man himself, Diddy. Trevor froze. He'd seen Diddy on TV, of course, but in person, the man exuded an aura that was almost otherworldly. He was dressed in a sharp white suit, a cigar in one hand and a glass of cognac in the other. He didn't seem to notice Trevor, or the pizzas for that matter, as he leaned in close to whisper something to a woman on his arm. But Trevor's moment of awe was cut short when the bodyguard from earlier clapped him on the shoulder. "Follow me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Trevor hesitated but eventually followed the man through the throng of guests, the pizza boxes now forgotten. They climbed a set of stairs and entered a room that was quieter, though no less opulent. It was a private lounge, its walls lined with black velvet and gold accents. The music here was softer, a sultry jazz tune that made the space feel even more intimate. "Wait here," the bodyguard instructed, disappearing through another door. Trevor stood awkwardly, clutching his delivery bag like a lifeline. He couldn't help but notice the odd details of the room, the faint smell of smoke that didn't match the sweetness of cigars, the strange symbols etched into the corners of the mirrors. He told himself he was imagining things, that the heady mix of sensory overload and fatigue was playing tricks on him. But then the nightmares began. It started subtly, like a flicker at the edge of his vision. He thought he saw someone standing in the corner, but when he turned, the space was empty. The lights seemed to dim, the shadows growing longer and more sinister. And then he heard it, a low whisper, just on the edge of comprehension. At first, he thought it was the jazz singer crooning through the speakers, but the voice was too close, too intimate, as if it were inside his head. "They know you're here," the voice said. Trevor's heart raced. He backed toward the door, his fingers fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that spoke of things he couldn't understand. Rituals, sacrifices, deals made under moonlight. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pulsating like a living thing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the door burst open and the bodyguard returned. "Diddy wants to see you," he said, as if nothing was amiss. Trevor wanted to protest, to demand an explanation for what he'd just experienced, but his voice failed him. He followed the bodyguard through a series of hallways until they reached a massive door that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. The bodyguard pushed it open, revealing a room bathed in golden light. Diddy sat on a throne-like chair at the center, flanked by two women who looked like they'd stepped out of a dream. The air was thick with incense, and the walls were adorned with artwork that defied explanation, images that seemed to shift and writhe when Trevor tried to focus on them. "Trevor!" Diddy boomed, his smile wide and dazzling. "You brought the pizza, my man!" Trevor nodded, his mouth dry. He handed over the receipt, hoping to make this as quick as possible, but Diddy waved it away. "Keep the change," he said. In fact, he snapped his fingers, and one of the women handed Trevor a stack of $100 bills that was more money than he made in a month. "Thanks," Trevor stammered, clutching the cash like a lifeline. "Enjoy yourself, man," Diddy said, raising his glass in a toast. "This is a night to remember." Trevor nodded and turned to leave, but as he stepped back into the hallway, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A man in a mask, elaborate, golden, and grotesque, was leading a group of people down a corridor. They moved in perfect unison, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Trevor's instincts screamed at him to follow, to see where they were going, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. It was only later, after he'd left the townhouse and returned to the relative normalcy of his cramped apartment, that he realized how deeply the night had affected him. For weeks, he dreamed of that hallway, of the whispers and the masks. He began to notice strange things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, a persistent feeling of being watched. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, a byproduct of too much stress and too little sleep, but deep down, he knew the truth. Trevor never delivered to that townhouse again. In fact, he quit his job at Tony's a few months later, moving back to his hometown in upstate New York. But even there, far from the glitz and glamour of Manhattan, he couldn't escape the memories. Every so often, he would hear whispers in the dead of night or catch a glimpse of a shadow that didn't belong. He tried to forget, but the nightmares persisted, a constant reminder of the strange, dark world he'd glimpsed at Diddy's party. Years later, Trevor would tell his story to anyone who would listen, though most people dismissed it as a wild exaggeration, or the delusions of a sleep-deprived delivery guy. But Trevor knew what he saw. He knew the truth about those parties, about the things that happened behind closed doors. And every time he saw Diddy on TV, smiling that same dazzling smile, he couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets was the man hiding? Trevor's life had taken on a peculiar rhythm after that fateful night. Though he had returned to the relative quiet of upstate New York, a gnawing unease followed him like a shadow. He tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, getting a job at a local diner, reconnecting with old friends, but there was no escaping the lingering effects of what he had witnessed. Trevor didn't just carry memories. He carried the weight of knowing something was fundamentally wrong in the world, something lurking just beneath the surface of the ordinary. One evening, as Trevor was flipping burgers in the diner's cramped kitchen, he overheard two truckers at the counter talking about celebrity parties. They weren't discussing Diddy specifically, but their laughter and speculation about the wild lives of the rich and famous struck a chord. Trevor's pulse quickened as he strained to listen, but their conversation remained lighthearted, far removed from the unsettling truths he knew. Still, it stirred something in him, a desire to make sense of what had happened. That night, after his shift, Trevor pulled out an old spiral notebook and began writing. At first, he wasn't sure what he was trying to accomplish. Was it a diary? A confession? An attempt to exorcise his demons? He wrote about the townhouse, the velvet room, the whispers, and the masked procession. As the words flowed, he felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. It was cathartic to get the details out of his head, but it also solidified something he had been trying to deny. That night wasn't just a one-off experience. It was the tip of an iceberg he couldn't ignore. The more Trevor wrote, the more his memories sharpened. He remembered small, seemingly insignificant details, like the way the fish in the aquarium seemed to glow unnaturally, or how the artwork on the walls appeared to shift when you weren't looking directly at it. And then there were the guests. Trevor had been too overwhelmed at the time to fully process their faces, but now, in his mind's eye, he could see them clearly. They weren't just models and celebrities. There were people whose faces seemed almost too perfect, their features symmetrical to the point of eeriness. And then, there were the ones who didn't quite fit, the quiet figures who lingered at the edges of the crowd, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory intensity. Trevor began to suspect that these weren't just partygoers, they were something else entirely. One name kept surfacing in his thoughts: Diddy. The man had been at the center of it all, exuding a charisma that bordered on hypnotic. Trevor couldn't shake the feeling that Diddy wasn't just the host of that party. He was its orchestrator, its conductor. The thought terrified him. What kind of power did Diddy wield? And more importantly, why had Trevor been allowed to witness it? The more he pondered, the more questions arose, each one more unsettling than the last. Trevor started to research Diddy obsessively. He scoured the internet for interviews, tabloid stories, and conspiracy theories, anything that might shed light on the man behind the persona. At first, it was the usual fare. Stories about his rise to fame, his business ventures, his extravagant lifestyle. But as Trevor dug deeper, he began to notice patterns. Mentions of mysterious events, rumors of exclusive parties where guests had to sign NDAs, whispers about connections to powerful figures in obscure circles. One particularly strange article caught his attention. It was an old blog post, buried deep in the recesses of the internet, written by someone claiming to have worked as a caterer at one of Diddy's parties. The post described a night eerily similar to Trevor's experience, complete with masked figures and unsettling whispers. The caterer had written about feeling a profound sense of wrongness, though they couldn't articulate why. The blog ended abruptly, with no follow-up posts or explanations. Trevor's heart raced as he read and reread the post. He wasn't alone. Someone else had seen it too, or at least something like it. But where was this person now? Why had their blog gone silent? Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, Trevor decided to take a risk. He reached out to the blog's author, using the email address listed on the site. His message was simple: "I think I know what you're talking about. I was there too. Please, let's talk." Days passed with no response. Trevor began to lose hope, convincing himself that the email would never be answered. Maybe the author had moved on, or maybe they had been silenced. But just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email reply, short and to the point. "Meet me at the Parkview Diner Tuesday, 8 p.m. Come alone." Trevor's hands shook as he read the message. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let sleeping dogs lie. But he couldn't. This was his chance to get answers, to find out if he wasn't crazy, or if he was. At least he wouldn't be alone in his madness. When Tuesday arrived, Trevor felt like he was walking to his own execution. The Parkview Diner was a quiet, unassuming place on the outskirts of town, the kind of spot where old-timers drank coffee and swapped stories. Trevor scanned the room nervously as he entered, his eyes landing on a woman seated in a corner booth. She looked ordinary enough, mid-30s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that made him pause. "Trevor?" she asked as he approached. He nodded, sliding into the seat across from her. "Call me Lila," she said. Her tone was clipped, her gaze darting around the diner as if she were expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "You wrote the blog," Trevor said. It wasn't a question. Lila nodded. "I didn't think anyone would find it, let alone reach out. But here we are." Trevor leaned forward, his voice low. "What happened to you? At the party, I mean." Lila hesitated, her fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop. "It's hard to explain. You've seen it, so you know it's not just a normal party. There's something ancient about it. Something they're tapping into. The masks, the rituals, they're not just for show. They mean something." Trevor felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think it's some kind of cult?" Lila gave a bitter laugh. "Cult? Sure, if you want to call it that. But it's bigger than that. These people, they're not just playing dress-up. They're connected to something powerful. Something that goes beyond money or fame. And Diddy? He's at the center of it." Trevor's mind raced as he listened. "Why us?" he asked finally. "Why were we there? Why?" Lila's expression darkened. "That's the question, isn't it? I've been trying to figure that out for years. My best guess? We were expendable, disposable pawns in whatever game they're playing." Trevor's stomach churned. He thought back to the whispers, the symbols, the way the room had seemed alive. Have you ever heard things? Since that night, Lila's eyes widened. The whispers, she said softly. You've heard them too. Trevor nodded, his throat tightening. I thought I was going crazy. You're not, Lila said, but you're marked now. We both are. They don't just let people walk away from something like that. They're watching, waiting. For what? Trevor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila shook her head. I don't know, but I do know this. You can't ignore it. The more you try to pretend it didn't happen, the worse it gets. The conversation ended shortly after that, Lila making it clear she didn't want to stay in one place for too long. She scribbled her number on a napkin before leaving, urging Trevor to call her if he noticed anything strange. In the weeks that followed, Trevor couldn't shake the feeling that Lila was right. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, invading his dreams and waking hours alike. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, and Trevor often felt like he was being followed. He called Lila several times, their conversations becoming a lifeline as they tried to piece together the puzzle of what had happened to them. But one day, Lila stopped answering. Trevor's calls went straight to voicemail, and the fear he had been holding at bay came rushing back. He considered going to the police, but what could he say? That he had seen masks and heard whispers at a celebrity's party 10 years ago? They'd laugh him out of the station, or worse, they'd think he was insane. And so, Trevor did the only thing he could think of. He started writing again. This time, he wasn't just documenting his memories. He was connecting the dots, drawing on everything he and Lila had discussed. He wrote about the symbols, the rituals, the unnatural occurrences. He wrote about the power that seemed to radiate from Diddy and the way the guests had moved as if they were part of some unspoken choreography. As the pages filled, Trevor began to see a pattern, a web of connections that stretched far beyond that one night. The parties weren't isolated events. They were part of something larger, something that had been happening for years, maybe even decades. And at the center of it all was Diddy. Smiling that same dazzling Trevor's writing became an obsession, his notebook a mosaic of fragmented memories, speculations, and a growing catalog of evidence that pointed to something far greater than he had initially suspected. What had started as a desperate attempt to make sense of his own experience evolved into a full-blown investigation into the shadowy underpinnings of the celebrity world. He spent countless nights hunched over his laptop, poring over obscure forums, archived tabloids, and interviews. The more he dug, the more he realized how little anyone really knew about the mechanisms that powered the glittering machine of fame and fortune. One of his breakthroughs came in the form of an old VHS tape he stumbled upon at a thrift store. The tape was unmarked, sitting in a dusty corner among stacks of forgotten movies. Trevor wouldn't have given it a second glance if not for the strange pull he felt as he passed it. When he brought it home and popped it into his ancient VCR, he was stunned by what he saw. The footage was grainy, clearly filmed with a shaky handheld camera, but the setting was unmistakable. A lavish party filled with beautiful people dressed in extravagant costumes. Though it was unclear when or where the video was filmed, the opulence and eerie undertones mirrored Trevor's memories of Diddy's party. Guests danced and mingled in a haze of colored lights and smoke, but something about their movements felt wrong. It was too rehearsed, too synchronized, like they were all following a silent script. Then the camera panned, and Trevor's breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of the room, stood a figure he recognized immediately, Diddy. He was dressed in a black suit with gold accents, his presence commanding even in the low-quality footage. He raised a glass and said something. Though the tape had no audio, the room's reaction was instantaneous. The crowd erupted into cheers, and their movements became frenzied, almost animalistic. The camera shifted again, this time focusing on a group of people wearing masks, similar to the ones Trevor had seen that night in the townhouse. They stood in a circle, their hands clasped, their heads bowed. The tape ended abruptly after that, cutting to static. But Trevor couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled upon something significant. The discovery of the tape reinvigorated Trevor's investigation. He began to connect the masked figures to historical imagery of secret societies, groups like the Illuminati and Freemasons, whose rumored influence had permeated conspiracy theories for centuries. Though much of the information he found was sensationalized or outright ridiculous, there were common threads that matched what he had experienced: the use of symbols, the rituals, and the emphasis on power through exclusivity. Trevor's research also led him to other first-hand accounts, scattered across obscure corners of the internet. People claiming to have worked in catering, security, or other behind-the-scenes roles at high-profile events shared stories that mirrored his own. While the specifics varied, the recurring themes were impossible to ignore: masks, rituals, whispers, and an unshakable sense of dread. One night, Trevor stumbled upon a particularly chilling account on a defunct forum for former Hollywood insiders. The poster, who went by the username Watcher89, described working as a sound technician at a mansion party in Los Angeles. Like Trevor, they had initially dismissed the strange atmosphere as eccentricity, but as the night wore on, they became aware of a private gathering in a hidden room. They claimed to have overheard snippets of conversation about sacrifices and contracts, though they left before they could witness anything definitive. The post ended with a warning: if you're reading this, be careful. They don't just let people walk away, and if they can't silence you, they'll make sure no one believes you. Trevor felt a chill as he read the final line. The sense of being watched, of always looking over his shoulder, intensified. He began to notice small, unsettling details in his daily life. A black car parked outside his apartment for hours at a time. The same man in a suit seemingly showing up wherever he went. He tried to dismiss these as coincidences, the paranoia of a mind consumed by its own investigation. But deep down, he knew he was being followed. Despite the growing danger, Trevor couldn't stop. He felt like he was getting closer to the truth, and the closer he got, the more desperate he became to expose it. He started reaching out to journalists, hoping to find someone willing to take him seriously. Most dismissed him outright, their skepticism evident in their polite but curt responses. But one reporter, a freelance writer named Rachel Bennett, agreed to meet him. Rachel was sharp, no nonsense, and skeptical, but open-minded. She listened intently as Trevor recounted his story, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "This is a lot," she said finally, "but I've heard stranger things in this line of work. Do you have any hard evidence? Something I can use to back this up?" Trevor hesitated. "There's the tape," he said, pulling it out of his bag. "And I've got notes, accounts from other people who've experienced similar things. It's not concrete, but..." Rachel held up a hand. "It's a start. Let me look into this. If there's something there, I'll find it." For the first time in months, Trevor felt a glimmer of hope. He handed over the tape and copies of his notes, praying that Rachel would uncover something he had missed. Over the next few weeks, Rachel kept Trevor updated on her progress. She confirmed some of the connections he had suspected, links between Diddy's parties and other high-profile events with similar eerie elements. She even tracked down a few other witnesses, though most were too afraid to go on the record. But then, just as things seemed to be gaining momentum, Rachel went silent. Trevor's calls and emails went unanswered, and when he tried to visit her apartment, he found it empty. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Trevor's panic was immediate and overwhelming. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel had gotten too close to something dangerous. His own fear of being watched intensified, and he became increasingly reclusive, avoiding public places and keeping his phone off for fear it was being tracked. One night, while he was lying awake in his darkened apartment, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, but their tone was unmistakably threatening. Shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that defied logic. Trevor curled into a ball, his hands pressed to his ears, but the whispers persisted, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. When dawn finally broke, Trevor knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He began to write again, this time with a singular purpose: to document everything he knew and release it to the world. He compiled his notes, transcribed the whispers as best he could, and created an anonymous website where he uploaded it all. He titled it The Veil Uncovered and shared the link with every journalist, forum, and social media platform he could think of. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The website gained traction quickly, drawing both supporters and skeptics. Some people dismissed it as the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist, while others claimed it confirmed their own suspicions about the hidden world of the elite. Trevor received messages from strangers who shared their own experiences, their stories adding weight to his claims. But with the attention came danger. Trevor's apartment was broken into multiple times, though nothing was ever stolen. His email was hacked, and his bank account was mysteriously frozen. He began receiving anonymous threats, warning him to take the website down. Despite the growing risks, Trevor refused to back down. He believed that exposing the truth was worth any cost, even his own safety. He started working with a group of whistleblowers who helped him secure his data and spread his findings more widely. Together, they began to piece together a clearer picture of the secretive network that seemed to operate behind the scenes of the celebrity world. The revelations were staggering. Trevor uncovered connections to powerful political figures, multinational corporations, and even religious organizations. It became clear that this wasn't just about Diddy or his parties. It was about a global network that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and control. But Trevor knew the fight was far from over. The whispers still haunted him, a constant reminder of the forces he was up against. And though he had found allies in his quest for the truth, he also knew that some battles would have to be fought alone. Trevor's existence had become a constant balancing act between fear and resolve. The whispers, once sporadic and vague, were now an almost nightly occurrence, creeping into the edges of his consciousness as he tried to sleep. He began to suspect they weren't merely hallucinations brought on by stress, but something external, something actively trying to break him. Sometimes they sounded almost like chants, rhythmic and insistent, though still incomprehensible. When he tried to record them on his phone, the audio captured nothing but static, as if the whispers existed on a frequency beyond human technology. As his website gained traction, Trevor noticed something strange. Many of the messages he received were from people whose experiences didn't just align with his, they added new dimensions to his understanding. One message, from a woman in Germany, described a nearly identical encounter with masked figures at a party hosted by a well-known European aristocrat. Another, from a man in Brazil, spoke of seeing symbols at an event that matched those Trevor had sketched from memory. The patterns were undeniable, and they painted a chilling picture of a global network operating under a shared code. Trevor's breakthrough came when he received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have worked closely with the organizers of these elite gatherings. The tipster, who identified themselves only as Orion, sent a detailed email outlining the structure of what they called the Circle. According to Orion, this group wasn't just about wealth or influence, it was about power in its purest, most ancient form. They traced their rituals back to pre-Christian times, blending elements of various mystical traditions into a unified practice that centered on summoning and channeling energy. The masked figures, Orion explained, weren't just participants, they were conduits. The masks themselves were symbols, designed to strip away individuality and allow the wearer to become a vessel for something larger. The rituals weren't theatrical. They were real, deliberate acts meant to invoke forces that could alter reality in ways most people couldn't comprehend. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the wildest secrets a pizza delivery guy might reveal? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.